You are American, right?
Nope. That would make things a lot easier.
Welcome to the Settlers of Seoul podcast. I'm your host, Arius Dare. This episode's guest is Manuel Azuaje Alamo, a PhD candidate at Harvard University. Manuel came to Korea mid-last year to conduct research on his dissertation on world literature in East Asia. He speaks 7 languages and has lived in over half a dozen countries. Manuel spent several years in Japan, and you'll hear in this podcast a lot of references and inferences to the country as a reference point to placing Korea in context over certain topics and themes. We talk about growing up in Venezuela, the differences between Korea and Japan, how foreigners, especially Koreans, are received in Japan, the lifestyle of Tokyo compared to Seoul, language learning, and, of course, Japanese, Korean, and Chinese literature. A quick thank you for the tremendous feedback I received for the first episode. If you like this show, please do rate it on iTunes. That's the fastest way to help grow our audience. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter at Settlers of Seoul, and visit our website for guest bios, show notes, and links to things mentioned on the show. That's www.settlersofseoul.com. All right, here's Manuel Azuaje Alamo.
I was born in a very humble family in Venezuela. So my parents were part of that very first or second generation, I would guess, that benefited from free public education all the way up to university. So during the 80s, they were university students and they moved to Nicaragua during the Sandinista revolution that they had. You might remember that you had President Reagan back in the day. He was very much against that. So my parents were actually putting a lot of money into the Contras, which were basically anti-Sandinista guerrillas that would go out and would, I guess, terrify or do terrorist-like activities in Nicaragua. So anyway, at that point in time, my parents, they volunteered to go to Nicaragua and teach basically farmers and people of very low income, teach them how to read. So I was actually almost born in the country. My mother actually came back to Venezuela. She had me right after she left. She returned to Nicaragua. So my first passport has a picture of me at 3 weeks. A very funny picture. And I lived there until I was like 6 or 7, came back. And anyway, so all this time, my parents have been doing their degree in economics. They went on to, at least my dad, he went on to the private industry, the private sector, and he became a vice president at this bank. And as part of that, he traveled to the States to get an MBA at the University of Colorado. And that is when he took me, my brother, the whole family. Mm-hmm. And that's why I have very fond recollections of my time doing elementary school.
How long did you spend in Colorado? From what age to?
Very short, just a couple of years.
But it was a pretty positive experience for you.
Pretty positive and pretty. It just marks you. Because even after I came back to Venezuela, I had, this just a whole new language and this whole new perspective on the world. I mean, my classmates in Colorado, I went to the school, Martin Park Elementary up in Boulder, in which all my classmates were the sons and daughters of people doing, MBAs, masters, PhDs at the University of Colorado. So I had friends from Nepal, India, China, Taiwan, Morocco, just like right there in my classroom. So it really...
Now, was this the first time you had interacted with and been exposed to all different sorts of cultures? I don't know how multicultural Venezuela was at the time, but
yeah.
But this was the first time you're saying that you had contact with.
I mean, yeah, to this degree. I remember one of my classmates was from Japan, another one was from Korea. We had one of those, meet the parent family types of events, and they had food from so many countries that it really caused a very strong impression on me at the time. So anyways, after we came back...
You're how old at this point?
I was 13, I believe, when I came back. And I had, it was just coming back and it was business as usual, going to school. Even though some of my classes were in English, but I still wanted to learn other languages. And this is all because also my family, seeing me as somebody who might become like a diplomat or something like that in the future. So anyways, all this is happening in the mid to late 90s. And as you know, for our generation, worldwide, just Japanese culture is just something that's just so big and influential. You have video games, you have anime, animation, Japanese comics, Pokemon. It's a huge thing even now, 25 years later.
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, as of this recording, Pokemon Go launched a couple weeks ago, and you can still see people, young and old, on the subway, walking on the street, with their phones out, running into you a little bit more than usual.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think 50 years from now, or like 100 years from now, people will really see, at least this decade is a decade that's been really influenced by Japanese pop culture, especially if you were growing up. So as part of that, I got interested in Asian cultures. I was also a reader, an avid reader of James Clavell, who used to be the author of Shogun, which was a very famous novel, which later got turned into a TV series as well in the States.
Yeah, it's my understanding that Shogun really set the standard for a lot of Orientalism and tropes that we have about samurai and how would you say it?
Well, I wouldn't say that he did not invent them out of the blue. There was really many other works that, dealt with samurais and geishas and whatnot. But it was just a very well-written bestseller / thriller. And it was not only that book. He has, I think it was 6 to 7 other novels, like set in Hong Kong as well, both modern and pre-modern. So I was I read all that in English back home because, reading literature in English was a way for me to escape.
Now, at the turn of the century in Venezuela, was it easy to get your hands on English literature? To
some degree. So there might still be, I don't know nowadays if they still have it, there used to be a big institution whose name I think it was La Casa del Libro, which is roughly the House of Books. Basically, it used to be this fairly big library of books, and it had a huge collection of, I don't want to say literature in English, because that's the beauty of it. They had anything from high literature, highbrow stuff, to, pulp fiction, basically. So I grew up reading all the classics by Isaac Asimov, science fiction, Arthur C. Clarke as well. James Clavell's Shogun and all his other Asian novels were there. Jurassic Park. Those types of the type of books that were bestsellers in the 80s and 90s, when it was...
Did you encounter any Korean literature at that time?
Not really. Even anything from China or from Japan and the 90s. And, you got to remember, I was an early teenager back then. It's not as if I was looking specifically for that. I remember that, my first encounter with Asian literatures was when I was, I guess, around the same age, when I was 13. My dad has a huge collection of books. He is a really international reader in taste. So he had...
How many languages does he speak?
Not in terms of languages, just in terms of the books that he reads. Right now he's a big fan of Orhan Pamuk from Turkey, for example. His library had Dostoevsky, the big Russian names,
right,
but also had Mishima, the Japanese writer who was really famous in the Western world in the 60s and 70s. Dad had a Spanish translation of the book, which has, at the time, for me, had one of the most beautiful passages of just lyrical descriptions. Some of the opening passages described this Shinto ceremony, and just the language of it was just very beautiful and just very appealing to me. And that might be the first time that I had a book by Japanese or by Asian authors in my hands. So around the same time, I also started to teach myself Japanese because as I mentioned, I spoke English and Spanish at home, and I wanted something new. And I wanted it to be either Chinese or Korean or Japanese, or one of these ancient languages, because of books that I was reading, the anime as well that I was watching. And back then, mid-90s, late 90s.
Do you remember any animes that were really popular in Venezuela?
Saint Seiya became a very big hit in Latin America, as well as in Spain and in France. And along with Dragon Ball Z was one of the main reasons why you had this subculture, very emerging scene of, I guess, anime fans coming up.
This is in Latin America.
And in Spain and in Europe. And the connection between Latin America and Spain was that there was a very famous magazine in Spain called Dokan, which is an onomatopoeia in Japanese for punch. It's like when something hits something. So anyway, so this magazine, which came out almost before the internet, had news about the animal world of Japan. And it also included a CD with music and with like very short videos of Japanese, like upcoming Japanese animations and whatnot. And this is like 96, 97. So like we were like beginning to have internet. And here was this magazine from Spain that came with like, monthly with a CD, and you bought it and you felt this connection to this hobby that you had. We had friends that were like, wow, Dragon Ball Z, when it was just like beginning to come out in the States and in Latin America. It was like way ahead in Japan. So, like you could like see previews of like the fights, for example, that were going to be coming up in 2 years or so, whatever, right? And I remember like one of the things that magazine had as well was a small corner of Japanese language. Tables with hiragana and katakana. Ben was my friend back in high school, who also got a lot into anime. And we would, we were kids, so we would be bored in class and we would write notes to each other in Spanish, but writing it in katakana and hiragana.
They offer Japanese language at school. I remember going to school in the States, Japanese is among the most common offerings. It's usually Spanish, French, and Japanese.
Yeah. What about like 20 years ago, though? Because like that's when that was the issue for me. Like I wanted to learn the language, but there was like very, very few sources and tools for that. So one day, actually, my dad, he showed me this cutout that he got from the newspaper. And it was by the put up by the Japanese embassy, advertising Japanese language courses that they were going to have at the embassy in Caracas, in Venezuela.
How old were you at this time?
14, 15. I was very young. I was so young that here's the point of the story. Actually, I went to the embassy saying that I wanted to take their classes, and they would not let me because basically I was too young for them.
I see.
And they told me that this course was not really for me. It was a course that, as I later discovered when I ended up taking it, I discovered it was very geared towards people who had to go to Japan for business. So, like the first lesson of the course was like, Tanaka-san is going on this business trip, and you had like Tanaka-san, 出張に行きます, right? So like
business Japanese
through and through 101. But I was so insistent. So like I really went there for the first time. They, got rejected. I was like, okay, well, I'll come back when I'm older. So I came back when I was 14, and it was like, I'm back. Can I take the course?
You got a little hair on your chin.
Yeah, like I kind of like started shaving, and I know hiragana and katakana. By then, I was really, I used to practice a lot of it, and I think they asked for like my parents. They had to write like a letter of basically taking full responsibility for me taking the course, and it was something like we guarantee that he's gonna do his homework and study and not miss class and actually be like a good student. And I was the first, like, basically under 18 student of Japanese. And I want to say the first. And then after that, some of my really good friends from high school, they also joined. Now, Japanese classes at the Japanese embassy have become kind of a thing. And it's very common for young people. The sensei was a very interesting sensei. She had married Venezuelan of Italian descent, and she had...
Are there many of those?
Yes. There's... Why? Because basically, even though the country is in a bit of a mess now, it had one of the best economies in Latin America, and we actually welcomed a lot of refugees from Italy and Spain during both the Spanish Civil War and the following and during the Second World War. So we had a big population not only of Spaniards but also of people from Italy, Germany. I have a cousin who's a Slav from Yugoslavia. He's his grandfather, I believe.
Now, did they integrate very well with society? Were Venezuelans quite open?
Oh yeah. I mean,
they intermarry. They were able to get
jobs, they intermarry. They get jobs. They really built themselves. It was very common to have classmates from all sorts of... But you also had people, like my friend. I have a friend whose name was Boris. He was of German stock. I had friends from, even now, who are like, come from Greece, Spain.
Primarily Europeans. Were there any Japanese, Chinese, Korean,
very
East
few,
Asians? Very
few. That's why these classes at the Japanese embassy were very interesting, because the Japanese community in Venezuela was so small that, these classes were like one of the very few windows into their culture. I remember like one of the most interesting things that we did as part of the, the class was every year the Nihonjin Gakko, so the Japanese school, or the school for Japanese, children, which there's usually one in every country at least. Mm-hmm. The one in Caracas was so small that for the Undokai sports festival that Japanese schools have every year, they invited us so that, to go and watch the kids. And I think it was surreal. It was a fairly big building, built, in the style of a Japanese school. So basically, it's once you see it, you know what it is. If you've seen like any anime, you probably have an idea of what a Japanese school looked like.
Yeah, we'll include a picture of a Japanese school in the show notes.
Yeah, and it had a field, and I believe they had, for the whole school, maybe 7 to 8 kids. So there were like more of us students of Japanese going there to like cheer them up. Than
these were children of
anywhere from 8 to 16 or so.
And they were the offspring of businessmen or
or like diplomats in the country.
Right.
But I mean, like for us, like going there for the first time, and it was like a very Japanese event. It was not open invitation; like you had to be invited to attend this event. I remember, like, I asked my professor if I could, like, ask a friend to go, because one of the things that we heard was that they were going to have, like, garage sale. So they would sell Japanese books, Japanese manga, and we're talking, like, before Amazon, right? So this was, like, a one-in-a-lifetime chance to buy a book, a novel in Japanese, in the Japanese language.
Were you able to read it at this point?
No, it was 14 or so. I had studied language for, like, maybe a year. But it was a copy in Japanese translation of The Silence of the Lambs.
That's some nice reading material for a 14-year-old.
Yeah, I mean, why not, right? But like I was a kid, and you go in this. I think they had the books in the hallway of the school, and it's all in Japanese, so like in really hard Chinese characters in Hanja, or Kanji, or Hanzi. Like you have no idea what titles these are, but I was like, hey, I know this movie. a couple of years ago, I just picked it up. It was cool, and I also bought some magazines and stuff. But that was the size of the Japanese community. Like it was really, really small. So, anyways, I took classes in this neighborhood of Caracas. So my classes then were very interesting. It was me and people, working people. I mean, not working people, but people that had office jobs, and would come. There were evening classes twice a week.
How old were you when you decided that you knew you wanted to move to Japan?
That's a really hard question. That's like asking you, like, how old were you when you started shaving? It's one of those things like you know that it happened.
16 years,
point.
143 days. I know that off the top of my head.
Yeah, but for me it was a type of like, hey, it does make sense for me to if I'm like this much into the culture. Maybe not move, but at least you just want to travel there and see what it's like and see if it's as cool as it looks, right? In the anime and the movies and whatnot. The main factor for me, though, was because of my time living in the States and because of the fact that I pretty much read only in English after coming back to Venezuela, I really knew that I wanted to go to school in either the States or maybe the UK or Canada. The question for me was how to combine that with this interest in East Asia that I had. And it eventually led to me applying to this school in Canada, the University of Alberta, which is where I got my undergrad, that also had very strong links with schools in East Asia. This university was so international that at some point during my time there, they had this thing where you could go abroad for free. Basically, usually you would have to pay tuition to the university. But for like a year, they had such a big, intake of foreign students compared to like how many they were sending out, that they actually had this thing where they offered us to go abroad for free. And one of my friends from Mexico applied to that. And it's funny because he ended up coming to Korea, even though for him it was just like free tuition was what he was after.
This was mid-2000s.
It was like 2000
mid-aughts.
5?
Right.
Yeah, or so, 6. And anyways, this Mexican friend, I think he applied for like South Africa, Korea, and he got, I think, sent to Yonsei, if I'm correct. I remember meeting him after he came back, and by then I had already spent my time in Japan, and I remember like seeing him and seeing that my friend speaking Korean and be like, oh, I wanna be like that, speaking Korean, right? My first Korean friend or like encounter with Korean literature or culture or language was as an undergrad in the first week of university. I attended orientation for international students, and one of the friends that I made there was a Korean guy. His name was Kim. And
meet a lot of Kims and Lees.
You tend to,
and Junes. We
went for coffee after the orientation, and I told him that I I've been studying Japanese for a long time, and I hope to take Japanese classes at the university. And he was the first Korean that told me about Hangul. And he actually, proceeded to like grab a napkin and be like, well, here's how we, put a syllable together in the language. You grab a consonant and here's your vowel. And I just found it fascinating. So let's say in the year 2002 or 3, I went to Japan, to the University of Shizuoka.
This was your first time?
Yeah, Shizuoka Daigaku. And that coincided. It was the same year or the same period of time that Japan had this huge boom, the Hallyu boom, Kanryu, right? The Japanese.
Yeah, that was about the time that drama Winter Sonata came out.
I was there. I was ground zero in Japan when that happened. So I remember, Yon-sama. That coupled with the fact that many of my friends in Japan were Koreans, because, if you're a foreign student, you usually live in a dorm for foreign students in which at least half is either Chinese or Korean. So I had many Korean friends. And I also had many, if you're an expat in Japan, Koreans do make a big chunk of the minorities in Japan. So it was very normal for me to.
A few 100,000, correct?
Yeah, I think when I was there, I also started listening to NHK. Every week they have a 1-hour show of several languages. They have French, Spanish, German, Korean, and Chinese. And it's an interesting thing that they do in Japan because it's not only a radio show and a TV show, but you can also go to a bookstore and you can buy like that month's booklet, the textbook that they would use.
The textbook that they would use for their
radio lessons.
Their radio lessons, I see.
Yeah, or the TV lessons. Because it's two shows that, run concurrently. Right. One for the TV, one for the radio.
They still have that going on now.
Yeah.
I guess they have internet casting as well.
Yes.
Live streams, I guess.
Yes. They, not really, because it's Japan, so they have to make it complicated.
That's right.
You can listen to it online, but you have to, sign up. But back then, I started buying the green textbook, which is Korean. So every language has a different color. Chinese is purple and Korean is green. I started buying that, and I would listen to, the radio show. And then on the term after that in Japan, I started studying Korean in Japanese.
Now, this was during that first year that you were in Japan, and you were there as a international student from the University of Alberta.
Yep, pretty much.
Now, you're obviously Venezuelan. Was there any difficulty living in Japan at that time?
That's one of the questions that it really depends on the person and how.
Let's say
how tightly wound you are as a person and what background you come from. In my case, I really had a very positive, overwhelmingly positive experience living in Japan that first year. For the first couple of months, I lived in an international dorm for a while, and then I thought, no, I have to go and live with Japanese students. That was great. I got hazed.
Did you?
Yes. But here's the thing. It was not like I was the gaijin, the foreigner, and I was hazed. Everyone that got in who was new in the dorm got hazed.
So you would have felt more strange had you not been hazed in a way.
And it was funny in a way because I knew the guys that hazed me before I got. So basically they were friends from the University of Shizuoka that I knew. I knew them before I applied, and they were like, well, just heads up, if you come, you're going to have to go through this week of hazing that we put, the new kids through, but just giving you a heads up that's going to happen. I'm like, okay, I'll take my chances, but I really want to live in an old Japanese environment. Right? And so it's not like, oh, he's a foreigner, he's getting hazed. It's like, well, you're part of the team, so we're going to haze you too. So it in a weird way, it was inclusive.
Inclusive, yeah.
Yeah, very weird.
You're young, you're still learning both languages. Did you observe any difference in how the Korean students were treated compared to the other international students? You often hear of prejudice and stereotypes and diminished expectations for Koreans living in Japan. My understanding is that's largely in the past, and that's also quite regional. You're in a city. This is in the modern era.
Yeah.
Did you personally experience any of that? And if so, how did you react to that?
You mentioned that I was in a city. That's debatable. So Shizuoka is a very quiet city, very close to Mount Fuji. I could see Mount Fuji from my kitchen window. Wow. Basically, it was it is one of the hubs that connects Tokyo with Osaka, Kansai, Kyoto. But I would be hard-pressed to think that Japanese people think of it as a city. Like, it doesn't really have that critical mass of Koreans living in it. Like Osaka, for example. Force them to, like, make a ghetto to live.
Can you... So I just want to put a pin in that for a second. You mentioned Osaka and ghetto and Korean all in the same sentence.
Yep.
Would you mind elaborating on that?
Well, basically, Korean culture, let's call it Zainichi culture. So, 제일교포 culture in Korean. So, culture of, let's call them Korean descent, Japanese-born nationals. Osaka is famous for that. They have one of the, if I'm not mistaken, the biggest Korean towns in Japan. And it is a ghetto, and, it has both the benefits and the drawbacks of, any ghetto in the world. It makes it easier for people to target you. It also makes it easier for you to stand out, but it also offers a sort of, community and protection as well. Osaka is famous for that, whereas other cities in Japan don't have that type of local community. The other thing is that you have to remember, like, I am a student and I'm going to university, so the range of people that I know, university-going people that wouldn't really be prone to discriminate towards them.
Sure, not necessarily a representative sample.
Yeah. The other thing is that many of the people that I met were Koreans coming from Korea. So they face many different issues than those faced by Korean descent people in Japan. Just like the perspective that they have is different. I mean, if anything, and this was a very naive, I guess, worldview of me at the time, but like you mentioned, like as someone who looks very, non-Japanese, Western / minority person like me, if anything, Korean students at Japanese universities seemed almost worthy of envy because they can blend in way more, efficiently than you.
Well, they came from the country of the Winter Sonata.
Yeah. Not only that, they look Asian, and compared to like us, 외국인, gaijin in Japan, like the system asked more of them. It was more willing to accommodate them. It was more, people would think it more common for somebody from Korea coming to study in Japan and then staying in Japan and working as something more common than a Westerner coming to Japan, graduating on a Japanese university and working in Japan.
When you went to Japan in 2006, this was for good. This was in the long
after graduating. Yeah.
And how was your Japanese at this point?
So after moving back to Canada, right, I was reading novels in Japanese. And I remember reading...
Did you move on to Hannibal?
No, I wish. I did read my first Japanese novels in Japanese language in Japan that first year. I first read Murakami Haruki's very famous Norwegian Woods, which just had a movie come out, I think, a couple of years ago. That was the first book that I read in Japanese. There's been like so many after, of varying difficulties. Murakami's style is very friendly read, and then you progressively, read maybe Dazai Osamu, or you read, if you're confident, Mishima Yukio. If you want to get a headache, you get Kenzaburo, Oi Kenzaburo, right, in Japanese. So anyway, so fresh from my first year of living in Japan, I was reading Murakami Haruki, the big modern classics, Murakami Haruki, Yoshimoto Banana, all these authors of this.
And by this point, you knew that you wanted to study world literature, specifically East Asia.
Yeah. By then, I was already back in Canada, and I had already switched my majors to East Asian Studies major with Comparative Literature Minor.
Did you take any classes related to Korea or Korean language, or were there any artists, authors, entertainers that...
We didn't have any faculty for Korean studies back then.
Well, you had the internet, you had students, so was there anything that you remember from those years related to Korea, or were you much more focused on Japan at this point?
I was much more focused on Japan, but I remember I really wanted to study, for example, Chinese or Korean. So Korean was not offered at my school. For Chinese, we did have classes, but the way that the university system at the U of A was set up was that I would have had to pay an extra fee for those classes because I already had the credits that I needed.
I see.
So that kept me from, taking them. But I did attend Chinese poetry classes, which I to this day I find fascinating. Basically, the way that classical Chinese seems to seep into modern Korean and Japanese and Chinese, I think is very interesting for me.
And so this was in the mid-2000s. You had just spent a year in Japan.
A year in Japan.
We're
talking 2005.
2005.
Yeah.
Did you have any strong opinions about Korea, about the language, about the people? Did you think that it was a good country, a bad country?
I had a very positive image.
Country.
I mean, I remember, as I was saying earlier, I was in Japan, the summer of love between Japan and Korea, where they had
it was the land of beautiful people.
Yeah, Fuyu no Sonata, right? The Winter Sonata drama was just so big, and you had Japan-Korean World Cup had happened a couple of years ago as well. So there was this sense of Korean culture is kind of cool, and it's not a thing that we have to deride. It can be respected and can be learned from, and there can be friendship between the two countries, right? So
I think middle-aged Japanese women still take pilgrimages to Namison.
Yep.
The one of the filming locations for
old ladies. I have a classmate of mine now at Yonsei. She's like 20, all of 27, and she went to Namison like a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
Achilles' heel of my interest in Korean culture is that I'm not an avid watcher of Korean drama. I feel that if I was only like some of my friends that watch 3 hours of K-drama a day, my knowledge of the country's culture and the language would be that much better, right?
Right. What was your lens through which you saw Korea in the mid-2000s as a young college student in Alberta who just spent a year abroad?
A year abroad, yeah, kind of like watching Korea from afar, from Japan.
Right.
My image of Korea was, strangely, that it was much more Western. Seoul is a very modern, very kuruma shakai, but that's a Japanese word. So a very vehicle-centered society. People, like all the people seem to be driving cars. The houses seem big, like Full House. The house of the title is a beautiful house, like in the outskirts of Seoul.
Huge 2-story house with a beach. I think if I remember correctly, he drives a Mercedes, just like every Korean.
Yeah, so it was a very beautified image of the country. Whereas, I guess you can say this about Chinese dramas to some degree, that they show this hyper-modern, maybe postmodern would be a word for that, because they mix both culture and traditional culture, but also this idea of both Seoul and Shanghai, Beijing as very modern. Having lived in Japan with, it's very small cars and it's very lovely little roads and alleys. Like, wow, Korea must be like this really, really... So yeah, like actually that was my image, and I didn't come to Japan for the first time until a year after I graduated. And by that time I was...
You mean Korea?
Yes, sorry. I didn't come to Korea until a year after I graduated university. Moved to Japan. It's a very small province that would become very famous or infamous. I moved to Fukushima.
I haven't heard of it.
Yeah.
Something happened there?
Something happened. Maybe
the filming location of a movie or something.
Yeah. Godzilla.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But back then, for me, before the whole earthquake and the meltdown and whatnot, Fukushima was, for me anyways, it was a very conveniently placed, like 1 hour by bullet train from Tokyo, little Ken province of Japan, prefecture, there you go, that's the word, prefecture of Japan, in which I had a job. I was an English teacher at one of the...
Was this with the JET program?
No. I wish it could have been, but not being a citizen of the States, I couldn't apply for that. So I instead applied to a Hagwon, which placed me in Shirakawa, a lovely city of, I think, a little over 30,000 people. A great taste into that, life in rural Japan. I remember we didn't even have a movie theater, and that's how small we were. It was a microcosm, in a way, of Japan. You might know this, but Japan is world famous for haikyo. Haikyo is a Japanese word for abandoned buildings. Japan even has abandoned theme parks. One of these like offshoots of backpacking cultures that you go and you go into like really old buildings, hotels, resorts in the middle of the mountains that are like overtaken by vegetation. So anyways, I was living there, and I was teaching Japanese and considering where to go from there. I thought, hey, I really want to go into grad school for East Asian Studies. The scholarship of the Japanese Education Ministry, the MEXT scholarship. And that scholarship is kind of unique because they grant it to you a year before you go.
Right.
And so I had that.
And doesn't that deadline kind of change every year?
Ever so slightly,
yeah.
It does. So I got it pretty much a year before I had to go to Japan. And I was teaching in Japan. I was saving money. So I thought, hey, I'm going to have to wait a year anyways. Might as well go to Korea because I've been studying the language.
You had applied to Todai, Waseda. Where did you apply for graduate school?
That's the thing. That scholarship is, at least, I don't know how it is now, but it used to be that you first apply for the scholarship itself, and then you apply to the school, but not as a student. You apply first as a visiting fellow, and you don't really apply. You just tell the government of Japan which are your 3 picks to go. So mine were Waseda University, Meiji University, and Chiba University. Just to keep it chronological.
So anyway, you had a year.
Had a year off, had money in the bank. I thought, hey, I have this time, might as well go to Korea for the first time. So I did some shopping, bought a couple of tickets, and that was my first time coming to Korea.
You get off the plane in 2007, and I suppose this was Incheon, right? You didn't fly into
Incheon,
into Busan. Compared to your first impression off the plane in Narita, what was your impression when you first got off the plane in Incheon?
It was like switching from a computer with Windows to Windows in Korean, really. It's a different language, but the software, it's very similar. If you're, remember, it's like getting on the train, Tokyo, Narita, you fly, then you get on the train again to come to Incheon. Compare that to, say, flying to LaGuardia in New York, or, flying to Boston, whatever, and what you would see, it is way closer. So for me, it was like, oh, okay, I get it. It's kind of like Japan, but not really quite, but it's, it's a different but similar system, and especially when it pertains to technology. Mm-hmm. Back then, it was before smartphones, so you didn't really see a lot of people using them. But even back then, you saw that people in Seoul, I remember they had portable screens that they would watch Korean dramas and movies with.
Well, yeah, even the old pre-smartphone eras, I think that they could transmit TV signals. So people could watch TV quite easily. You had little antenna that you folded out of the phone. You occasionally still see it on the subway.
Yeah, but I mean, like back then, like compared to Japan, like the degree that people had these mini screens was amazing.
Light years ahead. Like in Japan, I remember back then we still had like flip phones. They had this thing in Japan called wansegu, which is a technology for airing, TV signals. But you wouldn't see as many people watching TV shows in the train as I saw in Seoul. So anyways, that first time I came, I backpacked. I stayed at a hotel in Jongno. Coming from Japan, actually, I bought a travel guide in Japanese. I would show it to people, and people would be like, why is this in Japanese and whatnot, right? You're in the right country, right? This is not Japan.
Yeah. But it was like, no, but it's Kangoku. So, being ever so stubborn, I would actually ask many questions in Japanese, just to see if how they reacted.
How imperialistic
I must have been, very imperialistic, very, but hey.
Yeah, it's something that's something I call the Weigogin free pass. It's really amazing how much patience and leeway you get in this country, and I'm sure even in 2007, 2008, it was even more so.
Yeah, well, I guess they had like a huge boom of Japanese tourists coming in, and so maybe if I asked them in Japanese for prices. And you'd be surprised, like in Myeongdong, for example, I had no problem just being like asking in Japanese and ordering Japanese. But that time I went to Busan, I went to Gyeongju, I went to like all the...
How long was your trip?
Barely over a week.
Wow.
The highlight,
you were busy. Gyeongju, Busan, Seoul.
I was busy. It was like 3 days Seoul, down to Busan, up to Gyeongju. And the anecdote for that trip was that I actually missed my train, my Busan-Seoul train. A day before my flight was set to leave from Incheon, I had to scramble. They had no KTXs going to Seoul. They told me, well, maybe if you go to the Busan bus station, they'll have buses to go to Seoul. Mm-hmm. So, like if you've been to Seoul, that KTX station and to Busan, the Busan KTX station and the Busan bus station are very far.
The very end of the
northern
Orange
part.
Line.
Yep. So anyways, I get there, they have nothing for Seoul. But they told me, hey, we can get you on a night bus to Incheon. Mm-hmm. And I was okay, I'll take it. It was interesting because I took this night train from Busan to Incheon. And I got to Incheon around 3 a.m. or so. And they must have left me in a very sketchy part of Incheon. Because I remember, it reminded me of Kabukicho in Tokyo, which is a notorious red light district of Tokyo. And it was...
This is probably because you were speaking Japanese on the bus. And they just dropped you off in the worst part of town they possibly could.
It was 3 a.m. Everything was closed. I ended up going to Jeonbang and staying the night. And they thought, hey, that's kind of cool. It's...
This is your very last night.
Very last night. So basically
on your very first trip to Korea.
Slept up for like 4 hours, grabbed my things. But yeah, it was a very good impression to the point that after I, did the interview for the next, got admitted into, as I mentioned, to Meiji, Chiba, and Waseda. And at that point, we're talking September of 2007. At that point, like, that's it. It's like you can just wait it out until the MEC scholarship kicks in April. So I thought, hey, let's just go to Korea again. I have, money in the bank and I want to learn the language. So I came here and I was a student at Korea University's Korean Language Institute.
Now, were you starting off as a complete greenhorn at this point? You didn't know how to speak it. You could probably read the Hangul at that point.
Yeah, I could read the Hangul and I could have, like a fairly, that type of very
rudimentary
kind of stuff. I got placed, I think, in the second level. Yeah, so, it's
like a step above.
I had like a basic level, and they put me in the second one.
I've heard pretty good things about Goryode's language program.
Yeah.
How was your experience at the time? I mean, this was 6-7 years ago, but how did you think it was? How did you think of the program?
I only have good memories of it. That being said, it's been 7 years, so I don't have bad memories of it. Mm-hmm. I don't know. There was something about Goryeo that I liked. Mm-hmm. Maybe the fact that they're like the native local university, with a history of, being not like Yonsei, which was a very missionary, grew up out of that. Whereas like Goryeo is more like
something more of a native creation.
Yeah, and also like Annam-yeok, I like the neighborhood. But then again, it's been like more than a decade. I think at that point,
I think it's still very much the same.
Yeah.
Compared to Shincheon, Yonsei area is kind of at the center of Seoul's nightlife. You have Hongdae and Yeonnam-dong and these other areas where Annam-dong has still, it's gentrified a bit.
Yeah.
You've got probably a lot more going on than you did 10 years ago, but for all intents and purposes, it's still a very old-fashioned part of town, which is an appeal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Right.
So yeah, like if you're a student out there listening, do your homework, and I'm sure you'll be able to find a neighborhood that fits your taste. Because beyond that, really, like learning a language I find usually much less to do with teachers that you have.
We should note here, how many languages do you speak?
It's more, I don't know, man, like 7 or so. It really depends how you count and like.
Once you get past 5, you just lose count.
Like once you go 3, 4, you really realize that it's all about the passion and all about that it becomes like a relationship, really. What keeps you connected to a certain language and culture. For some cases, it might be, hey, I like the music or the food or the people. I know people that hate the people in a certain language, but hate the food. But love the food or the language. They love the people of a certain country, but have no interest whatsoever in the music or the language. Ideally, it's good to have interest in all of, it is a language, it is a culture. It really comes down to what you, listener, you want to get out of learning the language.
You keep mentioning the differences between Japanese, but clearly you speak it fluently. You really enjoy Japan.
Yeah. But Japan has, what's the word I'm looking at here? Similar, but not. And I think
kind of similar?
Kind of similar. I guess you could say, culturally it is very different. But let's just speak logistics. So in Japan, people usually take the last train back home. The Shuden. So anywhere from 10:30 to 1 a.m. really in Tokyo, depending on how far away you live. Whereas in Seoul, I see people drinking outside have a much more cavalier attitude towards when they go back. So I remember like the first time that I stayed here, I would study and I would, 3 a.m., 4 a.m. easily. That's something that you don't really see in Japan. And I know people are going to be like, no, of course you see that. Yes, you do, but not to the extent that you really see here, and not as easy. So there was that aspect. And there's also the aspect that I really came to see after I moved to to China as well, of Korea is really being the mainland. It has a different vibe, definitely, from Japan, being an island country. Korea has, you're on the continent, and it just has a different vibe, which I thought was fascinating. Mm-hmm. And the history of Korea as well. I mean, all the things that it went through in the 20th century, and all the things that it stood for before that. Silla, Pekche, all those. That history for me is fascinating. Along with that, just having modern Seoul, which in many ways is a city that I like way more than almost all the other Chinese cities that I lived in. Seoul is a great city. And it is a city that I really enjoyed back then, 2 years ago, and I enjoy to live in today as well. The Gendai Bungeiron Kenkyushitsu in Japanese is the name of the department that I got admitted into at the University of Tokyo, and that's the Department of Contemporary Literary Studies. It was a very new department of comparative literature at the University of Tokyo. One of the professors there, Noya Fumiaki sensei, is one of the leading translators of Latin American literature into Japanese in Japan. And I knew of him because I read a very famous novel by Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Chronicle of a Death Foretold, translated by Professor Noya into Japanese. And I read that in Canada, actually, as an undergrad. So I knew of him, and he had a special lecture, I think, at Waseda. And I attended. I kind of met him. I got in contact with the Ministry of Education for them to switch my scholarship from Waseda into Todai. Mm-hmm. And starting in April of 2010, I started my master's/PhD program. It is public though, so it is not as shiny and new as Waseda or Keio. In terms of the faculty, they have the dream team pretty much in almost every position. And I was happy to attend.
How many years were you at Todai?
So I was there for, I think, 3 years and a half, almost 4. So what happened was, I finished my master's degree, and just as I was finishing, my department at the University of Tokyo hosted Professor David Damrosch, who is a world-renowned figure in comparative literature, who now teaches at Harvard University. He used to teach at Columbia. He has been one of the most vocal voices in this new century, really, into how we have to say, open up the study of the canon of literature to include works from non-Western cultures. And not only why we have to do it, but also how. And that is, problematic in many cases, like problematic being one of the words in academia that probably gets overused the most. But
he comes to Tokyo to give a speech.
I think it was a 2-day half and half lecture panel that he had. I was part of the team that translated for him during the Q&A section. So he gave his lecture in English, and after that he had a panel with Japanese professors. So I was sitting right behind him, speaking English, and they would answer in Japanese, and we would have to translate that into English for him. He mentioned, hey, you should, how would you like to consider coming to Harvard for the PhD? I think the PhD now, we're kind of looking for people like you with that type of multicultural, multilinguistic background, right? So I thought, hey, I thought he was being polite. Right.
Come to Harvard. It's just that easy.
Yeah. Right. So I thought, hey, well, I'll look into that later. And I eventually did. I looked up and I thought, well, let's see what happens. But I was pretty much set on finishing my degree at the University of Tokyo. If I hadn't done that, I would have probably just stayed at the University of Tokyo and finished my PhD there. But because I got a very generous offer from Harvard University, it was very hard to say no. I left for Harvard, and I was lucky in that I was also able to get fellowships and grants that allowed me to go to Beijing for Taiwan for a summer, and also now for Korea. So that the second summer that I had at Harvard, they gave me a summer grant to go to Beijing to study Chinese at this probably the best language program that I've ever taken, run in a collaboration between Harvard and the Beijing Language University. It's called Harvard in Beijing Academy. It's basically a very, very intense program. It runs like a fine machine. You have no idea. To this day, I'm amazed. Like every class was taught by not one, not two, but like 3 professors that rotated.
Wow.
So basically, they taught you like 2 hours in the morning.
These were Harvard professors.
Yes, some of them were Harvard, some of them were Beijing Language University professors. And so basically, you would go 2 or 3 hours in the morning and like 2 hours in the afternoon. And the 2 hours in the afternoon was like 1-on-1. It would be like a different person every day. So there was, you couldn't get like all chummy and you get lazy. Like you would always have to be like on your toes.
Which is exactly what you need.
Yeah, you need, and they had teachers from like Taiwan, Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, like so different parts of this huge sinosphere, this huge Chinese-speaking world. So
now, was this program? Is this indicative of a number of Chinese learning programs that you've encountered that you've heard of, or is this quite unique?
It is quite unique because they really try to bring you up to speed in Chinese as fast as they can. Mm-hmm. But they do so through a very, clever way because they realize that it is a group of students from American universities coming. Language classes, they don't really benefit if their student body comes from, all over the place. The way they can tailor the lessons to you is not as effective if, you have an undergrad, a grad student, somebody who works.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have a group of students that all come from the same, American system who are all like either undergrads or grad students, I think they can really target the things that they want to teach you.
Right. Yeah. So you have language training in Beijing, as well as Taiwan, and obviously for several years in Tokyo. Then you come here. You come to Seoul in 2016.
Yeah.
And at the time of this recording, you've been here for how long?
Half a year.
Half a year now.
A bit over half a year.
And you're planning to stay at least for one more.
Yeah, to say thank you to the Korean government.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Korea Foundation?
Yeah, the Korea Foundation is great. I've been to a few of their conferences, and they're quite generous for non-Koreans who are interested in publishing some sort of academic work or learning the language. Some people might call them the propaganda wing of the Korean government in terms of trying to make Korea as salient as they possibly can. But
I think every culture does that. I mean, every country to some degree. You're like, it's like a person. You really want to put your like best foot forward, right?
Yeah. I guess Hollywood does that to quite a big degree.
Yeah,
we have Star Wars, so
yeah. Well, you have the Fulbright in the States as well. Japan has the Max scholarship, and China has the Confucius Institute as well. But yeah, Korea Fellowship Foundation, like you mentioned, like doing great work in translating and helping translations of Korean literature, which is, Han Kang won the Man Booker Prize for literature last year, which is probably the most important prize in literature won by a Korean native writing in Korean. Through the support of translation of Korean literature, they can please the gods of the Swedish gods of the Nobel Prize Committee.
So you're here in Korea, you're studying the language. As we mentioned before, you speak several. Is there something unique about learning Korean that you haven't encountered before, whether it be in syntax or structure, or what is something that you didn't anticipate with the language?
It's kind of a hard question because I have done 90% of my study of Korean either in or through the Japanese language, which is probably the most, amongst the major languages, it's probably the closest one you can get to Korean in both syntax and word order. There's also a huge pool of common Chinese characters that they use that were either used in Korea before the Japanese came or that they used when the Japanese came and when they, right? So the things that look uniquely Korean to me or odd are usually from a Japanese perspective. So it's kind of hard to describe this in English.
It's a very different approach than I think most non-Korean learners of the language are mostly coming from the Anglosphere. They're not necessarily coming from a Japanese background and then using that as an entry point.
Yeah. Like in many ways, I think, say a language like Chinese, for example, I could go on about what I find is unique or hard, even though I think that Korean is harder to some degree than Chinese because I've done my study of Japanese, of Korean through Japanese. Like, for example, you would have to be very knowledgeable in Japanese to know that the wa-ga difference one of the key things that you do in Japanese is different in Korean, and that Korean doesn't have the strong possessive particle no that Japanese had. Right there, as someone that comes from speaking Japanese, speaking Korean, that is, those two things are like the biggest challenges, I feel. The way that negation is handled in Korea is also fairly different from modern Japanese, more reminiscent of classical Japanese, really.
Let's stay on Japan as kind of your point of reference. You've been here for about 6 months as of this recording, and I'm curious, what strikes you as some of the biggest differences living in Seoul compared to living in Tokyo?
So one of the main features of living in Tokyo is that every station, or main station of Tokyo almost, has its own personality and its own almost ecosystem.
Could you give us an example?
Yes. So I am sure that there is a huge difference between the people that live or that frequent, say, Shincheon, Seoul Station, Seouldae Station, Annam Station, Jongno Station. You can just go on. It is obviously a very different feel. But in Japan, I feel the difference between, say, going to Akihabara, Ueno, then going down to Ginza, then, say, going to Harajuku, Shibuya, Daikanyama, Shinjuku, Kichijoji. So if you've never been in Japan, or if you've only been there for like a very short time, all these names really don't mean nothing. But if you live in Japan, there is a much stronger identity, when you want to call element to this. If you say, I live in Kichijoji or in Koenji, which are kind of like the hippie parts, or like Shimokitazawa.
I think in Seoul,
yeah,
Koreans, or maybe some non-Koreans, but they will pay a lot of money to have a zip code, Upyeonbono, in Gangnam.
Yeah.
Even if it's right down the block, much cheaper. They're making some fresh coffee for us. You can hear the beans grinding right now.
Yep.
Even if you live just down the block, it's a cheaper place, quite comparable in terms of amenities. We're only talking a block away. They will avoid that. I shouldn't overgeneralize, but many Koreans care about where their residence is and what it says about them and as the elite.
Yeah.
A source of that is from that zip code, from where their kids go to school, where they shop, what kind of cars they drive.
I mean, I do agree that it is, obviously, I think in any country you would have that type of, clique by social class element to it. Whereas you have that in Tokyo, of course, but you also have this image of the girl that goes in to, say, Harajuku on the weekends, all the way from Utsunomiya, which is like a 3-hour train ride, just to be in Harajuku from like 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. on a Saturday, right? That type of, let's call it allegiance by neighborhood, where it's not that you live in it, it's that you're willing to travel to be part of that culture, to be part of, say, the culture of the Harajuku lolikosu thing, so the girls that like to dress in Lolita Gothic, dresses. Or if
I sense a Vice.com story.
No, they could. I mean, like Harajuku is the, it's like the culture, the petri dish, really, of subcultures in Japan. One of them. The other being Akihabara, right? People from Chiba. So it's like, I don't know, from Suwon or even farther away coming from Chiba to Akihabara just to go to like a maid cafe and chill for the weekend. It is helped also by the fact that the train system in Tokyo is a bit more complex. So you have the Yamanote line, which usually runs over the ground. And then you have the other minor metros. Some of them run over the ground, some run under and they have, the way you move across Tokyo is different as well, from Seoul. What you do, I guess, my point here is I feel a much bigger gap in culture and identity that I feel. And that also translates how Korea is more homogenous as a culture than Japan. In Seoul, there's a very, even though there's much more people now that, dye their hair, you see people with like gray, purple hair once in a while, there's nothing that's as out there, I feel, and in as many numbers as you would see in Tokyo. And that for me is the biggest difference in terms of living in both.
So trains number
cities.
one. Number two, cultural homogeneity.
Yes. The culture, being much more homogeneous here and much more.
As a foreigner, which city do you think is easier to live in? Let's say let's give an example here. So average girl or guy from the United States
Yep.
with limited language in both.
Honestly, you just go to Taipei. People in Taipei people will speak in English to you and they love you. Even myself, as someone that I moved to Taipei after living for a year in Beijing and being fairly fluent in Chinese, they would speak to me in English a lot. Japan, in that regard, is not as, I don't want to say advanced, because it's a language issue, right? It's not as reliant on English as I think Koreans in general have a better grasp of the English language than your average Japanese speaker. So if you come here as somebody who speaks English from the States, probably Korea might be a bit easier. But I think Tokyo would probably be my recommendation because it has more foreigners than Seoul. It is a bit more. It has traveled more miles along this path of, becoming an international city. Even though Seoul has made great strides in that regard. And just like in terms of a place that's easy to live in, I think Japan always ranks pretty much high amid the list.
Has your opinion of Korea changed much in the 6 months that you've been here, maybe compared to previous trips, compared to your first time here 7 or 8 years ago?
Well, I think the most positive change that we've seen is the whole...
No, don't give us the positive. Give us the bad stuff.
Yeah, well, it's all rolled into one, really, because it's a positive thing that shows you the negative aspects of the country. And it's the whole Chesunshil development, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah, because you were here for only a few weeks at that point.
Yeah, but the whole collusion between the power and chaebol and government is it's not news if you followed East Asian politics, right?
Sure.
But it is very, very encouraging to see that the huge outpour of national outrage, of common citizens in Korea that were able to bring about, a good end, I guess, to this whole crisis. And you hope that in this aspect, I guess, I think Japanese politics could, if they had something similar, it'd be a positive, I guess evolution would be a word, or change.
What kind of change, what kind of positivity do you mean specifically regarding the Chesunshil scandal?
For example, the Abe Shinzo government has faced opposition to some of their changes that they're going through. The biggest of them is their continued efforts to change the constitution so that Japan can change from a peaceful nation, as it's in the constitution, into a nation that, as Abe Shinzo himself and probably his, people in his side would say, a quote-unquote normal country that can have, a navy and army. Many Japanese citizens feel unease about the way that this debate has been developing in Japan. And many feel that Abe's government and party might make use of the continued state of global events, say with ISIS and with the threat of terrorism and whatnot, and the growing sense of competition with China to change the constitution. And there has also been in Japan many public demonstrations of Japanese people out in the streets protesting against what they perceive to be Abe's very sneaky way of trying to change the constitution. So in this regard, I think that Koreans have shown how this citizen-led movement for protest can bring about a peaceful, democratic resolution to some of these clashes between political interests in the country. And I think that in general, that type of open, heated debate is something that would be welcome in Japan.
Not just Japan, but I think many countries around the world. The day after Donald Trump was elected, I remember I wrote, as America takes a big step backwards, Korea is making huge strides forwards in terms of democracy. And it's important to note that Korea has been a democracy for less than 3 decades. And to have this type of tremendous movement of peaceful, we cannot underscore that enough, peaceful protest and demonstration is just incredibly inspiring. It is absolutely the most proud I've ever been to live here, to be to consider myself a settler of Seoul. What is something that you wish you could have told yourself before you came to Seoul that you've learned now that you felt you should have been better prepared for?
That's a challenging question. The only thing that I wish I had done, really, and, I still have a far ways to go in learning the language and getting used to the culture and, all that. So I'm just going to keep it very logistical, is I wish I had brought an international driver's license to the country. Because, Korea is in a way, compact enough that you can really, if I had like a motorcycle or a car, I feel that I could really go out there and get to know very small country, towns of Korea, the rice paddies, which is something that I really enjoyed when I lived in Japan. I used to have a motorcycle there, and I used to love spending my weekends, out in a place that looked out of a, Miyazaki Hayao movie. My Neighbor Totoro and all those. Yeah, so basically all his movies are based in not all of them, but a big part of them are based in the countryside. Mm-hmm. And that is something that I'm afraid I might not get a feel of living here in Seoul.
Well, we have a car, so you'll just have to hop in the back seat one of these days.
I guess. But that is a risk that many settlers of Seoul, I guess, have in that... Also of Seoul, of Tokyo,
Koreans
Beijing,
and
Shanghai.
non-Koreans alike. There's a concept called Seoul Cheonnom and Seoul Cheonnya, which is what people outside of Seoul call Koreans in Seoul, which is because it's a derogatory term meant to indicate that you don't know anything about your country except within the boundaries of the city. Yeah. And in my own experiences, that is an absolutely true archetype of people. Yeah. All right, I'm going to ask you several questions, kind of a rapid fire round.
Yep.
You don't have to answer them as quickly as I'm asking. You can take your time if you'd like, and consider this a bonus round. Mm-hmm. So, if there's something that you could change about Korea, what would it be above all else?
That's a tough question. I really like it as it is. I would make it so that foreigners would make it easier so foreigners would have less trouble signing up for all sorts of cards and internet systems that ask for your national identification number. So many of those things I've been trying to sign up for things, and then you eventually hit like a paywall or anything like that, and then if you're a foreigner, it just becomes a bit challenging.
Well, if you're a foreigner who uses Google Chrome or Mozilla, you're in for a bad time.
Yeah, well, not only is the overuse of embedded codecs and that type of technology, but just it would be nice to have more ease in using things like online services that ask you for your ID number. Mm-hmm. Obviously geared for the average Korean consumer, but they haven't thought of, hey, maybe foreigners want to use this platform too.
What is your favorite piece of Korean literature, and what is your most recommended piece of Korean literature?
Korea is one of the few remaining countries in which poetry is really as important as fiction. So as part of that, I've been reading Yu Dongju's literature, his poetry. Especially, I've been reading his book, Sky, the Wind, the Stars, and Poetry, which is a poetry collection, and I've been really enjoying it.
Now, is this something you would recommend as a gift?
Yeah. Also the poetry of Kim So-wol as well. Kim So-wol's, I think Professor David McCann at Harvard had a really good translation of his selected poetry come out a couple of years ago. So if you can get your hands on that, Kim So-wol is one of those poets that is well read not only in South Korea but also in North Korea.
What are some big themes that you've noticed between, say, Japanese, Chinese, and Korean poetry? Are there markers that really indicate, okay, this is definitely Korean, or this was definitely Joseon era, this was... Yeah. What are some common themes that you often encounter?
Well, especially in regards to Korean literature, I tend to focus more on the modern aspect of it.
What is the modern? What is the line here?
Well, the line here for Korean poetry would be anything after, contact with the Western world, especially with the coming of the Japanese.
Well, I mean, so coming of the Japanese in the late 1500s. I mean, you had the first church.
No, I mean, like in 1911ish or so.
Okay.
When the Japanese came to
20th century modern Korean literature.
Yeah, but there's a lot of contacts between classical Chinese literature and classical. So basically, anything before the modern time, and this is something that is being researched a lot lately, is the connections between Korea, Japan, and China through classical Chinese writing. A view that was put forth a lot last century was, this idea that both Japanese and Koreans had local vernacular literature that was their own, and that the literature that they had before that was written in classical Chinese was somehow foreign, somehow not really their own. So this idea has been challenged increasingly during the past decade or so. Many scholars are finding connections between this use of the classical Chinese language as a common language of literature in East Asia. And I think that is something that to me is fascinating. At the same time, my own specialty is modern. It's really doing modern Japanese literature. You do find a lot of echoes coming in from the classical literature that you have.
If somebody were interested in studying East Asian literature, what do you think is the best starting point?
Man, it really depends on so many factors. It's like any good piece of literature, the best, it's like when you give a friend a book, right? It's like, even if it's an awesome book, it might be the wrong friend. So it's really dependent on what that person's own interest and personality are. That being said, I would recommend, it's so hard. Is that person, does he or she like to read novels? Long novels, short novels? Does she prefer poetry?
So it sounds like you might want to start with a particular medium first and work your way out from there.
Medium, or just what type of sensibility that person has. I think, as I mentioned before, the poetry of Kim So-eul in Korean is very good. For Japanese, something like, I guess, the short works by Dazai Osamu, I always recommend to my friends. Chinese, to this day, classical Tang poetry, I like. Wang Wei, Li Bai, the big names. But yeah, there's just so much. With East Asian literature, that's almost like saying, out of the whole Western literature, what's a good starting point, right? For the Western literature aspect, you could go anything from the Bible up to Shakespeare or something like that, right? Sure. So for East Asian literature, there's just so much to choose from. I mean, obviously, if you have a scholarly interest, you would say the Analects, the Ono, Rongo in Japanese, Confucius writing, or you could say, hey, read some Genji, right? The classical Cheonghyunjeon in Korean, or do some Pansori. Mm-hmm. The other thing is that I love to listen to Pansori. I just love the performance aspect of it. This idea that you're telling a story through both singing and using that rhetorical language is an idea that I really find appealing. For Japanese too, rakugo, which is basically a humoristic monologue, is something that I find fascinating. And for Chinese, xiangshang, so crosstalk is how they translate it into English, is two-person comedic dialogue. So all these forms of communication that crisscross with literature, with the lived language, so to speak, is something that really fascinates me, even as I endeavor to be a scholar of literature. I think literature is just so connected with language that is interesting to see how it is shaped in these performances, right?
Last question. Mm-hmm. If you could put up a billboard at the busiest intersection in Seoul, what would it say? What would it have on it?
Wow, this is also it would probably say something like success is born out of failure. Something like that, something like, let's just chill. I think to some degree Korea's at this stage already where they, it's not sleeping on the laurels of success, but it's, they're comfortable. But I do feel that they are one of the more stressed East Asian countries, right? So my message would be just one of, carpe diem, seize the day, smell the flowers type of message.
Chill out is good. And that's also a good way to end the show.
Yeah, just chill out, enjoy life, and hopefully, ichigo ichie, right? Japanese saying means just enjoy every encounter in your life and get the fullest out of it.